Hi, everybody. Good evening. Hope you guys are all doing well. Um, Welcome to our 8 p.m. Friday chat. Thanks for joining me. It's nice to see where everyone's tuning in from. So if you can, throw it in the comments where you're from. Kind of helps me figure out where people are keeping their bees. It's been a little bit of a crazy day. I apologize. I had to take my daughter to urgent care this morning, and she is not happy camper. She's also 3, so she's all over the place, and she's like not a happy camper, half the time. But now she's like really not happy. All right. So first, real fast, I've been getting a lot of questions from people, from my students, about what to do with their frames of comb that are empty. They might be wet comb, which means that you had honey in them and put them in your extractor and extracted it, and now it's pretty much empty and it's not going in your beehive until springtime. So I do have a video, and I will put the link to it. It's on my YouTube channel, where I go through. It's kind of an older video. One of kind of my first, actually. It's called How to Store Comb Over the Winter. And I'm going to put it here in the comments. Now, it really kind of depends on your situation and where you are, what to do with the comb. For me, when I lived in Hawaii, I had a chest freezer and I just put my comb in there. There was really nowhere safe to store honeycomb in Hawaii because there's just tons of cockroaches and ants. And the farm I worked for, they had a warehouse, and they had a room in their warehouse that they kept air conditioned, cold enough to really keep the small hive beetles from not being too active. They had an area with a light that would kind of attract, I believe, the beetles, or maybe just the larvae. I'm not really sure. And that was enough to really just deter stuff from happening, and that's how they stored their frames until they were ready to put them back on the hive. For me, I had a chest freezer, and I had an old chest freezer that had broken, so I would store my frames in the chest freezer, and if I didn't have enough room in the big one, then I would put them in the big one to freeze them for a few days, and then I would put them in the broken chest freezer once they were frozen, because the seal on it was still good. So it just kept it safe from the cockroaches and ants and rodents and stuff. But for those of you that live in colder climates, you have more options, especially if you have an unfinished basement or a cold garage or a shed. It's really just before you put them back into the beehive, you want to freeze them, because probably when you're putting them in the hive, it's already going to be warm enough out that wax moth and other things could be, getting to them, and you don't want to introduce that into your hive. But there's the link right here in the comments from Beekeeping Made Simple. You can check out that video I made where I talk about a few different options for you, depending on where you live, what to do with those frames. So a little bit of an update. I filmed some videos, but I've just not had a chance to really post them because myself and my husband have really just been through the ringer with all of these colds and COVID and other, you name it. And we've gotten it in the last 3 months. We moved into our new house on Friday. So it has been 1 week exactly since we moved in, and it's been a lot. We're still living out of suitcases and stuff. Well, me and my husband are. The kids aren't. And it's been quite the undertaking. All of our stuff was, in a container. Well, not a container. It was a pod. So we sold almost everything, and we had just this 5 foot by 6 foot by 7 foot pod shipped across the ocean in the country. And so when we took all of our stuff out, like all the kitchen stuff had to be washed and everything's had been sitting in this pod and then in a storage unit for 3 months. Um, Fortunately, a few cockroaches from Hawaii had made their way into the pod, I believe, and they seem to have found the crumbs because it sat in front of our house, like in the street, for a few days, for 3 or 4 days, and they had found a jackpot. They I seem to have been living off of the crumbs they found in my son's car seat. Underneath the lining, there was all kinds of crumbs because he is a very messy kid and leaves lots of crumbs when he eats in his car seat. So we fortunately brought back some cockroaches from Hawaii. Uh, they no longer are alive, but that was fun. So on to beekeeping in cold climates. It is chilly here tonight. Turn the heat on, and it's like, I don't know, in the 50s or something. It's not too bad, but it is chilly for me. Um, and so, first off, a lot of people aren't sure when to prepare their hive for winter. And there is really no one set date. Year after year, it's going to be different. It's always better to do it too early than too late. That is the number one takeaway from this. You prepare your hive for winter too late, and you can cause problems. The beehive, the queen either will stop laying or she will be laying quite a bit less come the fall time around now. And so what you're really doing is just checking for the temperature outside. Well before you're preparing your hive for winter, you're going to put a mouse guard on once it starts to get cooler out at night, because that's when like mice might make a beehive their home. So that's something you prepare for, maybe late summer or early fall. And then there's going to come this time that it's going to start to get cooler out. Now, around the 65-degree Fahrenheit temperature is when the bees start to form like a loose cluster and will, produce heat and use each other to stay warm. And so you do not want to open up your beehive when it's at that point, especially if it's cloudy or especially if it's windy. So, I would assume almost everywhere you're going to experience this. You're going to have your days where you might get cold and it might be in the 60s for a few days, but then the next week it's going to warm up and you're going to have a few days that are in the low to mid 70s. And so even if it's too cold out to prepare your hive for winter, one weekend, there's a good chance that maybe the next weekend there's an opportunity. But if you have a full-time job, then you might not have as many the flexibility to be able to prepare this hive for winter whenever you want to. And so then you're going to want to do it a little bit earlier. But you want to prepare your hive for winter. You want to consolidate the hive. You want to make sure that they have food, they have honey. You want to take out a whole bunch of the empty supers you would have on top, a whole bunch of these empty brood frames that you have, and consolidate the brood, put it all together. You want, if there is brood, and you want to make it easy for yourself to be able to treat this hive and the brood one last time before winter time comes. Bring down those Varroa mite levels before you really can't do anything about it. And so when you're taking apart this hive and you are going to be checking in on the brood, you really want it to be over 65 degrees Fahrenheit, low wind, ideally sunny out as well. 70s, low 70s is really ideal. So that's really what you're looking for. If you're looking at the weather forecast and you're seeing that it looks like it's going to be in the 60s, then do this now, especially if you don't have the flexibility to go out and do this whenever you want to. So for some people, maybe you don't treat for varroa mites and that is entirely up to you. But if you are, what I usually tell people is like, even if you don't like the idea of putting a treatment in, and you want to breed your bees to be resistant to varroa mites, or breed bees that are resistant to varroa mites, if this is your first or second year, I really highly encourage you to just make your goal to be to keep your bees alive for one full year. Just like, just make that your simple goal, not to have this varroa resistant strain of bees or to be able to do everything perfectly, but to just keep them alive. And if you want to keep at least have in the springtime half your bees alive, like say you started out with 2 hives and you want at least one of those hives to survive, I strongly recommend you treating for varroa mites before you close up this hive for winter. And oxalic acid is a really great way to do this. You can dribble it in, you can use a vaporizer, but now they also have these strips, which are great if you're a beginner, because uh, there's a learning curve to using the vaporizer, and the dribble method. They've studies have shown that it can shorten the bee's lifespan to dribble the oxalic acid within the hive. So I really I think it's called Varoxan or something, and you can find it on some beekeeping supply sites. And there are strips that you put in the hive that are oxalic acid, or you can use the vaporizer or the dribble method. But it's a really great way to lower your varroa mite levels. Now, if you're still seeing brood in the hive, which means there's baby bees, the queen is still laying, then you're going to have to administer the oxalic acid. I would say like 2 or 3 times after that initial time. And you want it to be about 5 days apart, ideally. If you have to do this on the weekends because you're working and it has to be 7 days apart, then so be it. But you just want to keep on getting the emerging brood that's going to have varroa mites on them. And so the majority of the varroa mites in a hive are on the pupating bees and the cells. You can't see them. And so when those pupating bees hatch, they're going to have a whole bunch of varroa mites on them, because that varroa mite goes in there and she lays eggs, and those eggs hatch and they are adult mites, and they now, you know, make babies with the other mites that are in that cell with them. And there's like multiple like lifespans that are going on, life cycles in this cell on this pupating bee. So this pupating bee may never hatch. It may hatch and be severely deformed, have deformed wings, might not be able to fly. And so once this bee hatches with all these mites on it, then that's when you want to get those mites again. So if you're not seeing any brood, then great. You can just do one dosage, one administration of the dribble method or the vaporizer. If you're seeing brood present, then you're going to have to do it like in phases. You have to do it like 3 times, 3 or 4 times, or you can put those strips in. And that's the beauty of those strips, is that they continue to release it, just like the formic acid pads or the Apagard or the Apavar. That's what makes them so much easier, is that you put it in the hive and it continues to be released and exposed to the bees. So when bees are hatching, then they are being exposed to this stuff. Because I don't think there's any treatment. I could be wrong, but I don't think there's any treatment that can get past the beeswax some walls of the pupating bees and get to those pupa. And that's where all of the mites are. That's where they're doing their thing. That's like their favorite spot to be in the beehive. So that's that precursor to preparing your hive for winter, is doing that oxalic or some kind of treatment to lower the varroa mite levels. And then you want to consolidate your hive. You want to make sure that they have as much honey as you can leave them. A lot of the United States 35 pounds can be sufficient. If you're in more of the northern states where you have a longer winter, 50 pounds is even better. You want to make sure that you have backup feed on top of that. I also have a video that I made last year, or maybe early this year, I can't quite remember, that talks about ventilation in your beehive. And there's this big question about whether like how to provide ventilation for your bees, because for one, the bees need to come and go from the hive no matter how cold it gets. Well, not no matter how cold it gets. If it gets really cold, they're not going to be coming and going. But there are going to be warm days for most beehives. There's going to be these warm days when the sun's going to hit the hive and the bees are going to come and go, and they're going to go on cleansing flights, and you're going to see, like, little specks in the snow if there's snow on the ground. And this is very important for the bees because this is them defecating, and this is very important. If they can't leave the hive and they can't do this, then they can develop nosema, which is spores in their digestive tract. So you really want the bees to be able to leave the hive. Some people will just leave that lower entrance open, not all the way open like in summertime, but leave a space open, and that's it. But there's problems with that because you want a little bit more ventilation than that. If it snows a whole bunch, if a whole bunch of bees die and block up the entrance, you just want there to be a secondary way for, at the very least, ventilation to get into the hive, so that until you were able to go out there and see what's happened and clear out a way, that there's airflow at the very least. So you want at least one way for the bees to come and go from the hive, and you want a secondary way for there to be airflow. But on top of that, some people will have a secondary entrance at the top of their beehive. And this can just be like a little notch in your inner cover, or this can be, some inner covers come with them notched in them, or some people will just drill a 3/4 inch hole into their box that is at the top of the hive where they have their food. And this is just an additional way for bees to come and go. Now, some people like it because it gives the bees an easier way to come and go from the hive and go on those cleansing flights once the brood has moved up, which is what happens, probably around the January time. Other people say that it's allowing way too much heat out of the hive, and the bees are working hard to keep that brood warm. The queen starts laying again. If some people say that their queens lay year round, but if your queen stopped, then she would be starting to lay again, probably by January. And when she's laying, the bees need to keep that brood warm. And so if you have this entrance, just like if you had a window open in the upstairs of your house, then the bees have to work even harder to keep that brood warm. Other people like that upper entrance because it allows humidity to escape. So that video kind of goes through the pros and cons to having that upper entrance. But at the very least, what I recommend is having that lower entrance and having a screened bottom on your beehive. And then what you do, now that the election is over, you can get one of those political signs or corrugated plastic, if you want to just get a plain one from the hardware store, and you cut it down so that well, this is, I guess, a pretty good example. So say the white part is is your screen, and then you would cut the plastic so that it has about an inch gap, so that most of the screen, your bottom board that's screened, is going to be covered by your corrugated plastic. But you're just going to have like an inch or so, half an inch gap on the sides, so that when condensation does form on the walls and drips down, it comes out the bottom and just doesn't pool up in this big puddle down at the bottom. And it also allows just ventilation. It's an additional way to offer ventilation for your bees over the wintertime. I saw that there's a few questions here. So let's see. Yikes. Franktown, Colorado is 18 inches of snow and counting. I've never been to Colorado. My husband really wanted to move to Colorado instead of Pennsylvania. I said, if we're going to still be that far from family, I'm going to stay in Hawaii. Thank you very much. Pamela says, hello, in upstate New York, would you use a condensing hive or ventilated hive for the winter? I don't know what a condensing hive is, but you definitely want ventilation in your hive. I mean, it doesn't really matter what, I mean, it matters, but almost any of these hives will work. Whatever kind of hive you buy, you can just make it work for you. There's going to be condensation in your beehive. That's a big one because it's cold outside and warm in the beehive. The bees are producing this heat, and so the cold air hits the warmth in the inside, and that forms condensation within your beehive. So that's actually a really good thing. I've read a lot of studies doing that video that I just posted here at the bottom in the comments about whether an upper entrance is bad for bees. And I read a lot of studies about condensation in the beehive before I filmed that video. It is really good to have condensation in the beehive. It is necessary. It's important. It is a part of what goes on in the beehive in the wintertime. So it's not a bad thing. It's not something you want to prevent. It's just, there's one study, they said that the majority of the condensation forms on the walls of the beehive. And that's a good thing. So, it's fine to wrap your hives or to get those bee cozies, but you do want, to a certain extent, especially, if you're getting like the cheap pine beehives, or you're making them from that thinner wood, you want, you don't want the wind to be able to just blow right through through the cracks of that beehive, but you do want condensation to form on your walls, and that's where the majority of the condensation is in the beehive. It's on the walls of the hive, and the bees need this moisture. It's very important for them. So that's where the screened bottom comes in handy, because this condensation forms on the walls and drips down, and you want it to be able to get out. You don't want it to just sit there on the bottom, but you do want it to exist. The problem is that the bees start as a cluster in the bottom box of the beehive, and then they make their way up eating the honey. And so they say that you want to make this like bell shape with your honey in the hive, so that the bees, it's where the bees are going to be traveling. The bees are going to be traveling up, and then the lid of the beehive is where condensation can also form. So you want to have a layer of insulation under your lid to, like a moisture board is good. And then you're also going to have your food, your backup food, like candy, or it can be just dry white sugar. And what I've always recommended is to just have this under your lid, your candy or dry white sugar. And so when condensation forms under your lid, it will drip onto the food. And so then it will get absorbed by the food and it will not be wasted and the bees can still access it. But when that cluster is forming down at the bottom in your beehive and makes its way up, the condensation isn't dripping off your lid and onto your bees. Now, when I my first couple of years beekeeping, I built top bar hives, and that was a hard part for me, figuring out how to prevent the condensation and insulating the hive and all that stuff with the top bar. It's a little bit easier with the Langstroth hive, but it can also be done with the top bar as well. So condensation isn't bad, and so I've always deterred people from using the quilt boxes because what those things do is it's like this box up above your boxes of honey, your box of honey and your food for the bees, and it has materials in it that absorbs moisture. The thing is that like it can get wet pretty fast and you're going to have to keep on pulling out the wet stuff and putting in dry stuff, and it can cause mold to start to grow in your hive. For some people it works well. I do not know how often they're going out there to swap it out, but sometimes some things can end up causing more harm than good for the bees, and so those quilt boxes in some cases can end up making your bees worse off, even though you're trying to help them. Sarah says she's had good luck with Apogard. Yeah, Apogard is a really great treatment. I don't use Apogard. I wouldn't use Apogard in the fall before I close the hive up for winter, just because it works so well the other times of the year, and it doesn't have. You can't use it. It can cause the bees to abscond if it's really hot out, but it is a great option in the springtime. And you can just use a little bit less when it is summertime and it is hot out. And so since you don't want to use the same treatment every single time, oxalic acid is usually the one that people use in the fall because there's little to no brood present, and so it works really well. Any other time of year you use oxalic acid, you're gonna have to administer it like 3-4 times, and that can become a pain. If you only have a couple hives, then not so much. But when you have like, over 20 hives, then it starts to become a pain to administer the oxalic acid, every 5 days for, these 3 or 4 increments. But yeah, Apogard is a great treatment. It is thymol based. It is not considered organic, but it is nowhere near as toxic as Apovar, and isn't as stinky as the Formic, and doesn't cause queen loss the way Formic can. Can't imagine 50 degrees after Hawaii. It's been a transition, that's for sure. Sarah wants to know if anyone's battling wasps or hornets. Man, I can't. It's driving me crazy. I have the biggest smudge on my glasses, and I can't for the life of me find the cloth I use to clean my eyeglasses, and it's driving me crazy because I keep using like my t-shirt and towels. It's not working. I need that little eyeglass thing. Anyway, I have the first video out for my beekeeper's diary, which is just me talking about getting started again. And then once I have the bees, I'll just be doing these like videos of me out with the bees, not so much teaching you about things, but I'll just show you like me opening the hive problems and like what I'm doing about it. So the next one should be next week, and don't really want to promise anything because I'm scared too after almost having to go to the hospital with my daughter today. But the next one is about finding Beehive Spy and the equipment, because I'm going to try to buy things for any kind of Black Friday deals. But the Bee Club I joined also, they have a service where people can post things, and people have posted some really good deals on used beekeeping equipment that I might take advantage of as well. And then I'll make a video showing the backyard. I've met both of my next door neighbors. Don't have anyone behind us. It's just a road and then some horses. They seem friendly. They've come over to say hi, actually. So yeah, I don't really know how they will do with. I haven't asked the neighbors if they're okay with me putting bees there yet. So I still need to find a backup location, but I'll get more into that, into those beekeeper diary videos. M. Smith says, how about using a 1/4 inch mesh screen for a mouse guard? 1/4 inch. As long as it's big enough for the bees to get through, that's fine. You definitely, and if it's a screen, then yeah, if it's wire, you don't want to use anything that's wooden or any kind of fabric, because mice will chew through the wood. And any of those screens that aren't wire, they're pretty sneaky. They don't need to make a very big hole. Patty says, I took out my apivar strips 3 weeks ago. 2 days ago, I put a sticky board in 2 hives. One hive dropped a lot of mites, probably 30. The other only had a couple. Thoughts on why this would be? Well, for one, sticky boards are not very accurate, like, at all. So I have trouble really telling, like, when I see a mite on those things. But because there's like pollen and parts of bees and stuff that get stuck on it. But apivar is not always effective. It used to work really well for me in Hawaii, and it didn't. It stopped at, I don't know, like 4 years, 5 years ago. It stopped being very effective. Just the Varroa mites can develop a resistance to it. So if people are using it, like, it's their just the treatment that they use all the time, and they use it spring, summer, fall, or if they put it in the hive and just leave it there and they don't take it out after 6 weeks, that's how the Varroa develop resistance to it. And so if that's happened in your area, if the bees you bought, or they just had a lot of mites in their hive that were resistant to the apivar, then it's not going to work very well. So it's not an ideal treatment to use this time of year, because you don't really have time for a backup. Not everyone does. It really depends. If you're like in Georgia, then yeah, it's not cold enough out that you can't like just put in another treatment. It's really good though, if you're going to use apivar, to take a mite sample afterwards to see if it's effective, because then you're seeing that it worked in one hive and didn't work in the other. To be honest, those sticky boards aren't really, they're not effective, not only because you can't really see what it's hard to tell what is a mite and what's just other debris, but also so many of the mites are like in the pupating cells, and then there are mites that are just like they're between the segments on the bees, and they're not necessarily falling off of the bees. So just because the mites like aren't falling off of the bees and landing on the sticky board doesn't mean that they're not there. It could just be an off day when the bees weren't like cleaning each other or themselves, and the mites weren't falling off, or they weren't as active that day. So a mite test with powdered sugar or alcohol. There's a few actually things you can use. You don't have to use alcohol. to do a mite test is the best way to see what your mite levels are, because it's possible that both of them have high mite levels. It's just the sticky board only showed you, only worked well for the one hive and not the other for whatever reason. And Pamela asks, if you use an insulated cover with a candy board, do you leave the inner cover on so the bees have to go through the hole to the food, or put it right over the bee frames? I mean, I wouldn't use it. I wouldn't use it. Like, when I did it, I put the candy over the inner cover. So if you have a candy board, then, I mean, only use the inner cover if there's like a purpose to it. You don't need to just stick it on because you think it needs to be there. If there's a notch in your inner cover and it's giving your bees an extra entrance in the upper section, or if it's, providing ventilation, or if it's holding your food. But if it's not doing anything, then, don't use it. It doesn't have to be there. It kind of depends on what your candy board looks like, because, like, I mean, that's kind of the purpose to it, is for the bees to go through that. If you just want it to not have the candy like sitting on your frames with your bees. So you can use the inner cover over your bees, or you can use it as a way to hold your food. But if there's no purpose to it and you're just giving the bees an extra step to get to their food, then that's not necessary. You don't really have to have it. My bees recently started congregating on my hummingbird feeders. Is that concerning? I don't know. They're just looking for food. It's not ideal food for them, but I guess if it's warm enough out that they're out flying around, then it's probably fine that they're gathering syrup at that time of year. Morning Glory says, so many wasps in Fort Worth, Texas. There are a ton of wasps. I was really surprised at how many wasps there were in Pennsylvania when we came. It was just, they were everywhere. Like everywhere. I hardly see any bees. I see a lot of bumblebees if I see bees, but just the wasps are everywhere. Like all different kinds of wasps. I was really surprised. I don't really know how observant I was of wasps before I left Pennsylvania, but I don't really recall seeing so many like I have now. How long are you supposed to feed bees syrup in the fall? You stop feeding the bees syrup once it is too cold out. So you want to take that syrup feed out, and you want to feed them candy or dry white sugar once you're closing the hive up for winter. Once it's like too cold out for the bees to leave the hive and to, go on a cleansing flight, once you're concerned about condensation forming in the hive because it's warm in the hive and cold outside, that's when you don't really want that syrup. I've heard different things about having that syrup feed in the hive, that it can cause extra moisture in it due to it evaporating, or that it's bad for the bees' digestion. I don't really like to say too much like what to do and what not to do, or that give you the impression that this is fact, because I'm not an entomologist and I haven't done this research myself. I've just read that it's not good to do it. And once the bees are at the point that they are not, actively flying and they're, in their hive clustered up, it's about that 65-degree Fahrenheit temperature, that's when you want to not have that bead in the hive, that syrup, and you want to close up the hive and give them the hard candy or the dry white sugar. One person says, I've seen a guy filling nylon stocking and placing it on a shim with a 1/4-inch screen on the bottom under the inner cover. Thoughts? Filling it with sugar and pollen. It's got quite. I'm trying to picture. I'm very tired. I got very little sleep last night. I've gotten very little sleep the last month. But okay, so first of all, I mean, if it works, if it's not falling out of the stocking and the bees can access it, then I guess so. You can also just pour the white sugar over the inner cover around the hole, and that is sufficient as well. I guess if you can fill it up and the bees can get to it, then it kind of makes sense. I'm really having a hard time picturing the 1/4-inch screen on the bottom under the inner cover and the shim and what that's really doing. Be a little bit careful with the pollen though. Just don't, if you're going to feed your bees pollen, buy the pollen from a beekeeping supply site. Don't buy pollen from a health food store or anything, because pollen can get moldy and it can go bad and all that stuff. The pollen that you're buying from the beekeeping supply site, they've dehydrated it or freeze dried it or done something to it so that it's not going bad. Or people will have pollen patties and things like that in the hive. I don't know if he's adding it to the sugar. I don't really know what kind of pollen he's using. Alice says, I was told not to feed dry sugar if there's enough stored honey, but to check on a warm day in January and feed if honey stores are depleted. I mean, that you could do it that way. It just seems, I just don't understand why you would wait until January to check to see, as opposed to just putting it in. Either way, I mean, it's not like the bees are going to go past the honey and go take the sugar up at the top because they prefer it. They're going to go past the honey and consume the honey, and then they'll continue to make their way up. And so, yeah, I mean, I would say it makes more sense to put the dry white sugar or a hard candy in the hive to start, because it's not going to go bad. And if the bees bypass their honey for whatever reason and want to use it early, then so be it. And if they choose to use the honey in their hive and not use it at all, then that's great. But it just seems like an added stress for the beekeeper to have to check in on a good day in January and to feed if they find it necessary, as opposed to just having it in there on a day when it worked for you. I mean, you could also put it in December or November. It's whatever works best for you, what makes it easier, so that you're not bothering the bees on a day when you really shouldn't be bothering the bees. Lilo and Stitch says, I was told to use bee syrup right now, 2-to-1 ratio, because the bees need the water from it. Um, it depends on the temperature is right now. If it's like well above 65 out and the bees are coming and going and doing their thing, then yeah, feed them syrup. Um, you mean a syrup of 2 parts sugar to 1 part water? You know what? People do all sorts of things. Some people feed 2 parts sugar to 1 part water because they say more sugar, the bees have to do less work to evaporate the moisture. Um, Other people do still just do a 1-to-1 ratio because they want to still simulate that nectar flow. They want the queen to keep laying. They want there to be as much brood as possible in the hive until it's time to close the hive up. So the more brood, the more winter bees there are to cluster up to keep the hive going. Everyone does things a little bit differently. I would just, start out with what makes most sense to you because a lot of these ways will work either way. A 2-to-1 ratio of sugar to water is fine. Um, but once it is getting cooler out and the bees are going to be staying in the hive and clustering up, then you want to take that syrup feed out and have the dry white sugar or the hard candy. Um, Craig says, my hives have post extraction wet frames in them. When should I remove them and switch to granulated sugar? Well, you want to take those frames out once the bees aren't bringing in an excess of honey and storing stuff in them. Um, you can leave some in if you have like gaps in your boxes. It's better to have that frame in there than, an empty gap in your beehive when you're closing it up and preparing it for winter. And it really just depends on what's going on right now outside in your area because like in Hawaii, I wouldn't put the wet frames back in. This time of year, there's nothing that's blooming really. The bees are just gathering enough to keep the hive going. They are maybe eating a little bit into their honey storage, and the small hive beetle population is very high. And so I consolidate the hives and take off all of those wet frames, just go into a freezer for storage. And I consolidate the hive so that there's only the brood and the rest of the honey that's in that second brood box. And that's usually it. Um, But that's because there's this small hive beetle population in the area and it's warm out and they're active, but the bee population is decreasing. So you just don't want too much space in your hive for the bees to guard, especially if you have small hive beetles in your area. You have a whole bunch of wet frames that have a little bit of honey on them. The bees aren't going on those frames. Those frames are empty in your hive. They're not bothering with them. That is like the first place that the small hive beetles are going to start laying their eggs, and those larvae are just going to be squirming around, sliming it up. So, I would take them out of the hive now, unless you have reason to think that the bees are going to be needing that space to fill it up. Like there's a nectar flow going on, something's blooming, that they need that space. Or if you just have gaps in your box and you can put a couple in there. But I wouldn't leave like an entire box of wet frames on the hive this time of year unless there's something blooming that makes you think that, the bees would swarm unless they had it on there. Jessica says, what if you have a lot of bears in your area? Um, so I've never lived in an area with a lot of bears, but I will tell you that this is what I have read. I had done that Penn State class years ago, and they have on there a bear fence that you can make. So What I've been told is that the only thing that will really deter bears is an electric fence. Some people say to put like a piece of bacon or something on the fence when it's on, because then the bears will touch that with their nose and then it will actually deter them, as opposed to if they just touch it with, you know, the rest of their body, it's not as sensitive and it might not deter them. But the big thing with bears is that there's a time of year when they're like really desperate to find as many, to get as many calories into their body as possible, and there's not as much food for them. So that is when, if you put an electric fence up, you want that fence on, because yeah, you're probably not going to want that fence on all the time, all year round. But there's a time when you really know that bears are like starting to make their way maybe a little bit closer to um, neighborhoods and people's homes and properties, and they're a little bit more like really looking for food. That's when you want the fence on. Once a bear, and just having the fence on, even without like the food on it, is often enough. But they say that once a bear has attacked a hive, then you're kind of screwed. And you might want to move your bees after that, because once they know what's inside those beehives, and then there's very little that will deter them from making their way to the beehives. If they don't know what's in those boxes and you have an electric fence up, um, and it zaps them, or if there's just like enough of a big fence up to keep them back, they don't really have a good reason to really go moseying around those boxes, especially if you've never left any pieces of honey and comb and stuff on the ground. You don't want, like open equipment and wet frames and, scraping off propolis and beeswax and honey off the sides of your hot tool and scraping it on the box or on the ground. Everything is being contained and you take it away with you. Then bears don't, they're less likely to know that there's anything that they will want in those boxes. But once they know what's in your beehive, and they've attacked your hive once, there's a really good chance that they're going to keep coming back, and there's not going to be so much you can do about it. That's all I know about bears. Pamela says, I still seeing a lot of drones in one of my hives. Is this a concern? It really depends on the time of year, but usually no. Drones are usually a sign of, well, if you're also seeing worker bees, I mean, if you're seeing just like adult drones, then that's just up to the hive to kick them out when they have determined that it is time that they don't need them anymore. It doesn't necessarily mean that the hive made those drones. The drones maybe are just like hanging out in that hive for whatever reason that day. They might move on to other hives in a day or two, or they might get kicked out any day now. But I wouldn't be concerned about it. Now, if you're seeing like drone brood, then that might be of concern, especially if you're only seeing drone brood and no worker bee brood, then that's a big problem. And that often means that you don't have a queen, or that your queen isn't fertile. Next comment. You previously said a ratio of 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 ratios are by volume, but I've been taught by weight. I really don't think it matters that much. I do by volume, but I really just, I don't think it matters too much. I wouldn't worry too much about it if you go one way or the other. TF says, do you have a video or suggestion on how to go back to deep frames from medium frames in the spring? I use a deep brood box on the bottom. Then for weight reasons, I went with 2 mediums instead of a second deep. I really do not like having all the medium frames when we go back to 2 deep boxes. Um, hmm. So what I used to do was have one deep box and then mediums on up above that. And um, it depends on whether you're looking to do two deep boxes or I mean either way I don't really see why it would be a problem. For one, you can put medium boxes in a deep as long as it's the first deep of your beehive. If it's like a bottom board and a deep box, you can put medium frames in that deep box. I have done it many, many times. What the bees will do is one of two things. They will just fill it up, and there will be a gap, like a couple inch gap from the bottom of the medium frame and the bottom board, which I think is a good thing because this is my theory. I don't really know, but it can potentially prevent a hive from swarming because it just has this gap in the brood. Kind of like I forget what they're called, but they're like a slatted rack. Maybe it's like a this wooden thing that has slats in it, and instead of a bottom board or above your bottom board, and the bees can go down in there, and it's to potentially prevent swarming. So you put medium frames in a deep box. The bees are either going to just fill up the frame, and there'll be just a couple inch gap, or the bees will build a little bit of comb off of it. They will not, I've never ever seen this. I've never seen the bees connect the bottom of the comb to your bottom board. You cannot put you cannot put medium frames in a deep box if the deep box is on top of another box. They will draw comb off the bottom of the frame. They will connect it to the frame below it, but they will not connect the comb to your bottom board. The only thing you have to be careful is if you use oxalic acid vaporizer, that plate gets hot. And if you're putting it in there, you want to make sure that it is not touching any comb that's hanging off of your frames because it can catch on fire and you can burn your beehive down. But you can put medium frames in the deep box and go back to a deep box. But when it comes to a deep box on top as your second box, you're going to have to just start out with all new deep frames, which I mean is doable. You might just have to get rid of, just store off or something those extra medium frames and put brand new deep frames in your beehives. Jessica says, should you use insulation to insulate the hive in very snowy places? Um, some people use bee cozies to wrap around the hive to insulate them. Some people use roofing paper that they wrap around the hive. Um, some people put them in sheds and structures to keep them safe from the snow. The only thing is that if you also get a good amount of like sunny days, the those insulation will prevent the sun from warming up your hive. So it really depends on what the majority is for your bees. If you're going to have like a big storm and there's going to be a lot of snow and wind, then you can put like the cozy on, and then once that storm is over and you have a couple weeks of just not so windy, snowy winter weather, and you have some nice sunny days, and you might want to take it off for a few days. I wouldn't go back out, like every day or 2 p.m. take the cozy off because the sun came out from behind the clouds, and put it back on at 5. But you can, like have it for when you really need it, and then take it off if there's those warm sunny days, if there's enough of it for it to be worth it. But yeah, I mean it depends on what your beehives are made out of, but a lot of these beehives that people are buying are just You know, they're not like they're the cheaper woods, and so they're not very well insulated. So if you're in a really cold place with a lot of snow and wind, then insulation is going to be beneficial for your bees, I'm sure. Okay, it is 9 o'clock and I have to go to bed because I'm very tired. And my daughter's snoring, so that's a good sign that I might be able to get a couple hours in a row of sleep. Thanks to everybody for logging in, and I hope to see you at the next Friday one on Tuesday. I'll be doing my live for just students and people that are members of my YouTube channel. Thanks for all the questions. And good luck with you and your bees. If there's a specific topic you want me to address for the next live one, then put it in the comments. And I will try my best to get to all of them. It's kind of coming up to that time of year when there's not a lot of beekeeping talk, you know. I had more topic ideas when I lived in a place where it was beekeeping year round. Now that it's not year round beekeeping, it's a little bit harder. I will probably maybe just talk about the equipment that I'm looking at buying. There's a few different hive styles out there that I wanted to try, and you know, some gloves and bales and jackets and hive tools and all of those things. All right. Good night and have a good weekend.